actually, Victoria was able to get my slides going here. So maybe you can give me, I can just share my screen and then we can go from there, if I can find them. PowerPoint, here we go. And play. There, can you see them? Can you give me a thumbs up, Victoria, if you can see the slides? Yep. Okay, great. Up. Okay, perfect. So I'm Gwen Heeley Akearok. I come from Iqaluit in Nunavut, and I thought Victoria just gave me so much leeway, such a broad, such a broad topic area that I wasn't sure what I should talk about, and so I thought maybe what I could share with you was some of our unique context in Nunavut around health and well-being and research and what that means for our communities. And give you a little insight into how we do what we do. So so with that, I'll just move on to the next slide. So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself and my connection to the work that I do at Qaujigiartiit. So I was born and raised in Iqaluit, so this is my home here, and continue to live here and work and raise my family here. My formal training is as an epidemiologist and public health researcher. So it's funny because every time I told anybody that I was an epidemiologist before COVID, people would be like, "Oh, is that a skin thing? What is that? Do you what do you do exactly?" Now everybody not only knows what an epidemiologist is, but has adopted our vernacular. So our terminology is like a Twitter hashtag. So anyway, that's me. So we've been busy, obviously, with COVID research here as well. So I've been working in circumpolar health in some way, shape, or form since about 2002. Both here in Nunavut and in Canada, but also in the circumpolar countries. And I co-founded Qaujigiartiit in 2006 with one of our late elders, Andrew Tarak Sr. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the story of our center and our evolution as a community organization throughout this presentation. And in this photo are my two daughters, who are 11 and 9 now, out for a skidoo ride. So one of the things I like to sort of highlight, I guess, in these kinds of conversations or discussions about health and well-being in the Arctic is that we are often confronted with discourses and visuals and media that show the Arctic vast empty space. And we are often faced with the question, where are our communities? Where are our communities on these maps and, in these conversations? And so these are just two examples. One is the map of Polinia's that was developed for some Arctic Council work and just the Arctic region in general on the right-hand side. And we're not there. We're not there. So this is one of the maps, one of my favorites. This is obviously produced in Canada, this map, but this map shows all the communities and often in their original names, if they had an original sort of non-colonial name. And of course, Canada's in the middle because we're Canadian and we put ourselves in the middle, but it's a nice big round circle. And so in our work, this is really our lens. People in the Canadian discourses often lump what's happening here into what's happening in Indigenous communities across Canada, but actually our contexts here are very unique. And when we think about what we're doing and how it impacts the people around us, we're often thinking around this circle. We're thinking around the Arctic. And so our view, I guess, is sort of top down when you think about it in in the sphere, the globe. And this map is another one that I like because it shows how our Arctic is not, whoops, I just got some feedback there, I think, on somebody's mic, but how our landscapes are not vast open wilderness. This is actually a map of what you might consider our superhighways, right? So this is a map of trails, Inuit trails, all through the Canadian North. And these are the trails that connect communities, that connect families to hunting grounds and ancestral spaces, and places that are rich with culture and story. And it is very, very occupied and well used. So this map's available. This was put together through a project at the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge University, and it's available on peninuittrails.org. And there are other such maps available as well. So I would encourage you to check out those other ones as well. So that sort of led to, that sort of leads me, I guess, into telling you a little bit more about us. So where we are on the map. And so Qaujigiartiit is located here on Baffin Island, or Qaujigiartiit as it's known here. And there are similar community-led research centers in the other two territories in Canada's north as well, in the Northwest Territories and in the Yukon, and we collaborate with them from time to time on different initiatives. But Qaujigiartiit is unique in the health and well-being research landscape because we are entirely independent and community-driven and not-for-profit. So, we are working in a very community-oriented space to answer the questions that people bring to us. And so Qaujigiartiit really grew out of that narrative of that the Arctic is empty and the few people who are there are just there, and maybe it's not really worth investing in because who cares about all that empty space. and so the researchers who had been coming here at that time were really just investigating questions that they had, their own personal curiosities and questions about the North and about the Arctic. And so our center grew out of that time and that climate where we have our own questions. We have needs, information needs related to health and well-being that we need to be answering. And there are ways that we can do that, and ways that we operate that are mindful of how our communities ask these questions and how we all, interrelate and interact with each other. And there are research methodologies that we can be using that bring all of this into practice and then produce evidence that can then be used for informed decision making here. And so I guess our center's sort of grown out of the need to counteract some of those narratives that don't value and appreciate the communities and peoples necessarily who are here. So as I said, Qaujigiartiit is an independent. We're Nunavut led. We're a health and well-being research center. We work on primarily addressing the questions and priorities of our people of Nunavut. And we are all community members working to advance the health of our communities. So we're really thinking, we're playing the long game, like the 7 generations approach, as some people say. We're thinking about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and how the actions and solutions and initiatives we undertake today will be impacting them. And Qaujigiartiit means looking for knowledge, and it was the name that Andrew, the elder with whom I co-founded the center, it was the name he gave to our center to describe what we needed to be doing. We do need to be looking for knowledge. We do need to be looking for solutions and information, because that's what leads us forward. That's what gives us direction. And so our goals as a research center are to be, to be cultivating a space where all of this work is done locally by Nunavummiut, by the people of Nunavummiut, and the people of Nunavut, and and in partnership with our communities. So I think part of what differentiates us from other research centers or research paradigms is that our center is not a fly in, fly out, sort of helicopter style place for research. It's a place that provides resources and shelter, I suppose, to Nunavummiut who have questions that they need to pursue in a way that honors the relationships they have with their community. And so, so a place that's safe, that's mindful of the ways in which we interact with each other and the values of our communities, and how knowledge is upheld in different ways, and all toward moving, how do I say this? I guess one of the things our elders say is that there is no research without action. So research just to be curious is not the way we do things. That we engage that curiosity and harness that need for information by following through to some sort of action. That's sort of the catalyst, I suppose, for our investigation. And so so everything we do is community-based, it's participatory action research. There's always an outcome or action associated with it, to be practical and pragmatic about addressing health and well-being concerns now and into the future. And so, of course, we primarily privilege Inuit epistemologies and ways of knowing when we do this, but also recognizing that, there are all kinds of ways of knowing and methodologies and approaches that can be harnessed to achieve what we want to achieve, as long as we're all in it together to support the health and improve the health of our communities and our families. So this is a pot of narwhal. Delicious. This is a food source for our communities, and sustainably harvested species. And when people think about the Arctic, especially lately, because narwhals have become so popular, like in children's books and things, I noticed. But it's always sort of this pristine, visual of sea ice and beautiful narwhals, and either narwhals or polar bears. When the average person sees or thinks about the Arctic, this is often a visual that I think is shared and comes to mind. And in reality, of course, it's this. So this is the beach here in Iqaluit, and it's covered in snow and sea ice from the tide. And just off into the distance, all those little bumps, that's the pack ice. And so that's going out onto the ocean. And this is a group of parents taking children from the school out on the land for the day. So, the sea ice is our pathway to well-being, in terms of being able to harvest, to be out together, building relationships together, honoring the environment together. And it's a busy place. And here's a picture of a muskox being harvested, a source of food and clothing for our communities. This is one of our elder instructors at Qaujigiartiit, posing with her students in one of our courses we deliver on Inuit child rearing and child development practices. And this is this is what our center is. This is the kind of research our center is focusing on the kinds of actions and activities and knowledge that brings us all closer together, and then moves that knowledge and that research into practice, usually through courses and training and development of different sectors here in the territory. This is a photo of two of our founding board members, these two youth who are now grown up, but this was at our original, one of our original founding gatherings in 2006, and they were scribbling down all these notes about what, what youth needed to see in an organization like ours. And so our organization is actually structured to allocate two of the seats on our board of directors to young people, to students and youth advocates. So their perspectives are valued at the highest level of governance in our organization. So to ensure that their perspectives flow through in everything we do. And I feel like this is also particularly important for Nunavut, where more than half of our population is under the age of 25. So we have a very large and vibrant population of young people here that we want to ensure are being heard in the work that we're doing. Everybody okay so far, Victoria? Do you want me to pause at any point or just keep going? Just, you can give me a thumbs up.
You could keep going. I am monitoring the chat. So we have a few folks who will ask you questions at the end and come on video, but I think you can continue on and then maybe we can do a full group question and answer so folks can come on.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll just keep going then. So this visual is here to remind us about the future, that this is what we're working for. So in this painting, the people have no faces because they haven't yet come to be. And they are who we're working for, our community members, children, families, future elders, are who are at the heart of our work. And so when we talk about what we're doing, we always say we come from a heart-centered space. And so this is often considered a totally, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess a totally different lens on what research is compared to like the traditional teachings of, the research paradigms that I've been trained in my formal education, but that I find are often at odds with my teachings as a community member from the community members around me and also the elders who are my teachers. And so at Qaujigiartiit in our staff discussions and our board discussions, we often talk about how our work comes from a heart-centered space, that we come from the heart and the rest will follow. And so our actions are rooted in the heart and the rest will follow. And so that speaks to a very specific way of operating and harnessing and moving knowledge forward in our communities that also holds us morally accountable as community members to upholding the values of our communities around us. So one of the other teachings from our elders is when they talk about children, they say, if you teach to the heart, the mind will follow. And I was in a meeting with a circle of elders about 2 years ago, and they were talking about the health and well-being of children. And one of their concerns, of course, that they were raising was today children are not taught to their hearts, they're taught to their minds. In their discussions about formal schooling and formal education, they said when they go to school, they're only being taught to their mind, but they're not being taught to their heart. So they're not being taught to be a good person in such a way that they can apply these teachings that are going to their minds. And so in our work as researchers, we work from the heart and the minds will follow. So often I think we at Qaujigiartiit are also confronted with a dominant narrative around what's here in the Arctic and what our capacities and capabilities are. And it's often, I think, in our media in Canada, Nunavut is often painted with a lot of negative statistics, and we do have a lot of challenges, absolutely. But we also have a lot of strengths. And so our center is built on the strengths of our knowledge, of our communities, of our relationships, and the way we work together. It's built on the pathways to well-being that exist in our life as people in the North. And we really focus on releasing the capacity that exists in our communities to foster those future generations that we think about. So that's, that's what community health looks like to us. We're building on all our strengths. So so as part of trying to elevate our way of doing and being, thinking about research and health and well-being in the Arctic, as part of elevating that to a larger audience, we published our research model, which is called Pilri Qaujigiartiit, which is the concept of working together for the common good. And at Qaujigiartiit, that's what we're doing. We're working as a collective for the common good of our communities. And so this concept, these values that underpin our work and our heart-centered space are about working together for the common good, about Inuit, which is being respectful of all human beings. Uniqueness is about the story, the power and meaning of story, and the role of story in our lives, and how much is communicated through story when we're listening to someone's narrative, in a study on cancer and palliative care, for example, when we are listening to the old stories and the stories of elders and the lessons and morals that are embedded in those stories. There's story plays a huge role in our lives here, and then it has to be respected, of course, in our work and how we protect and engage with the stories of others as researchers. And the next part is around then how the notion of all knowing and learning sort of comes into one. So it's kind of like reaching an aha moment, I guess, like to the point where you've just been so immersed in your data and in your narratives and in the context of whatever you're looking at, that suddenly you come to a place of realization. So Andrew, when he talked about it with me, he would always say it was like taking everything you've learned since kindergarten and then suddenly becoming aware and coming to a place of realization. So that's sort of like data analysis, if you think about it. And then finally, Pittialnuk is to be good or be kind. So when my kids were small and they were kind of annoying each other, like you just say Pittialnuk, like be nice, be good, be kind to each other. And that's really how our communities talk about ethics and being ethical, in both the research space and just in our conduct in life. So these values were sort of came together into this model, this Pilri Qaujigiartiit model, for as our way of explaining how we operate. So children and families and communities are at the center of our research, and then this bubbles around that. I know the text is very small. It's very annoying. I need my reading glasses also to see it. But basically our philosophy is that anyone and everyone can be involved in research in our communities as long as we're all working to that common goal of improving the health of our people. And so the little bubbles just sort of serve as a reminder of all the different stakeholders, I guess you could say, that can be pulled in and invited into projects, who might have other invaluable perspectives. And then that's all framed within the values that I just described. So this is the model that guides all of every single research project that takes place at Qaujigiartiit, and has done so since 2006. And sorry, I thought I had a screenshot of the publication, but it's published in the International Journal of Critical Indigenous Studies if you want to learn more about it. It's an open access publication. So what does all that mean as researchers, for me as an epidemiologist, for us as community members in the Arctic? What are we actually doing? What do we do day to day? Well, this is the list. So we held a number of community engagement sessions when we were first creating the center that allowed us to speak to people from all over Nunavut to talk about what their priorities were for health, for research, for children, for themselves. It was just wonderful. And we had 3 of these sessions all across the territory, and we flew people in to these gatherings, and we had high school students coming from the high school, and it was a very enriching discussion. And so this was their list of priorities. And one of the things you'll notice maybe right away is that all overlapping. So they're not mutually exclusive categories, but this was how our community members wanted to explain and articulate all of the things that they felt we needed more information about to make good decisions and take positive actions. And so this sort of last one at the end, I find actually to be the most interesting. The first 4 kind of give us a lot of clear direction, and especially in the context of settlement here in our region, and residential schools, and historical outbreaks of influenza in the past, and how that changed the dynamics of families here. The first 4 categories fall quite naturally into that context. And then this 5th one always sort of seemed like a bit of a catch-all, where people were putting stuff that they couldn't always quite find the language for. And really what this last sort of category is for me is in Inuktitut, there's a concept called Piiksilnuk. And it's the concept of giving without the expectation of return, sort of like volunteerism, but bigger and richer than maybe just that word. But it's how we are making a contribution to the collective well-being. And so and so to me, this last category sort of starts to scratch the surface about what that means for people, and where that might be missing in today's context, in today's busy communities, and in the lives people are leading. So that's sort of how I interpret that last bit. But anyhow, this is our guide. These are our guide, and communities continue to come to us regularly with questions, with project ideas, with requests for information that then we go forward and work on either with or for them. So as such, then we have in our work, we have about 50% of our work is community-based projects. It's specific, arts-based. We have an arts-based sexual health intervention that we work on with schools, with students in grades 9 through 12. We have child and youth mental health projects. We have climate change and health adaptation projects. We have sort of lots going on that is all very community-based. And then about 40% of our work is like territorial in scope. So this example of the cancer care and palliative care study was right across Nunavut. Same with the outcomes of land-based mental health programs and addictions treatment, and things like that. So about 50% is community-based, 40% is about territorial, like with a territory-wide focus. And then the last 10% is sort of on a circumpolar level. So for example, right now we're part of a team leading a project looking at case studies in all 8 Arctic countries on the impact of COVID-19 on Arctic communities, and in particular on Indigenous communities. And so we have connections with our colleagues around the Arctic to work together and investigate questions at the ground level, all around the Arctic. So some of the other areas that we like to think we are leading the way in, or at least hoping to make a contribution to, in the academic and non-academic spaces, is we really try to elevate Inuit research methods and approaches into the academic space. We know that the way knowledge is viewed and approached, and just even philosophically how we come to know what we know, or as human beings, that the philosophy related to that, and different epistemologies and pedagogies is unique here, and we try to elevate that into the academic space. We definitely are leading the way in arts-based public health research methods in Canada, different consent procedures in different languages and audio and video protocols. We've set up our own ethics review board here, the first and only REB in Nunavut, for providing research review for any project undertaken by our center, as well as contributing to the hospital-based ethics committee as well here. And then quite a lot of teaching and training. We have a number of courses that are being accredited, graduate level certificates and community research workshops. And then we have a really awesome and dynamic team, and they're all great guest lecturers that I would totally recommend get invited out to talk about their work, because they're all far more amazing and interesting probably than me, I think. And then we provide some limited student supervision for our students from Nunavut who go away and come back to do practicums, or we sit on committees, thesis committees and things like that. So we're kind of slowly growing our profile outwards around teaching and training. So in all of that, in the Arctic research landscape, I think what makes us unique is, we are people from our communities working on questions, and we do this through the model that is based on the values of our communities. That's based on this model, and then we're taking the findings and applying them, in our work. I think part of our uniqueness, one of our strengths and one of our challenges, is that we are community members and we have findings from our research. And so then, if it takes us 10 or 15 or 20 years to implement them, we're here and we're doing it. We're not flying in and flying out and dropping off a report and saying good luck. We're here. So if we want to see that change, we have to affect it. And that is both a strength and a challenge for us, because there are all sorts of challenges with affecting systemic change, and it is a long-term investment. And so that becomes, both uplifting and exhausting, I think, at times. I think we're a part of a growing movement. I've observed a growing movement of Northern researchers who are self-established, who are, especially in North America, who are looking to elevate the profiles of their communities and the ways in which, and the factors that shape what research is here. And whereas in the past, I think, where I described this sort of fly in, fly out helicopter research phenomenon, and academics would come here looking for ideas and, partnerships. Now I think we're sort of turning the tables, turning the tide, and we're setting our own research agenda and questions. And then we look to the academy and other sectors to build those relationships, to collaborate on research. So just changing the power dynamic there, I think. And we are connected across the Arctic. We share similarities. There are differences, of course, unique uniquenesses, I guess, that we celebrate our diversity around the Arctic. But there are also a lot of similarities, and this affinity for innovation that's so exciting. And I think I think we have so much to offer. Like, we're creative and we're exciting, and we're doing innovative things for our communities, that we hope others are excited to learn from and share with us, in our exciting way forward. We also have ventured into app development. So if you're curious, you can, this app is available for free on Apple and Android phones. But one of the persistent challenges in our healthcare system is the reliance on fly in, fly out healthcare workers. And they often come without any cultural or community orientation. And so with our communities wanted us to develop an app that would provide that to incoming or short-term healthcare staff, especially now in the times of COVID, of course. But this was actually an initiative that launched 2 years ago. And so we actually have 2 apps that are out now for various sectors, providing some of that information and in the voice of our communities. So the voices of our community members are in the app, telling these workers what they need them to know before they come here. So now we're kind of moving into some technological spaces as well for our interventions. So anyway, that's all really, I guess, I wanted to share from our story today. And I want to say, thank you. And I'm happy to spend the next 15 minutes working on any questions or doing my best to try. I can't promise I'll have any answers, but I can try to answer some questions. And I'm putting our contact information up, but we're pretty active on social media. On there's the Twitter address, and then we're also on Facebook and Instagram. If you found anything that I said interesting and you want to follow along what we're doing, we have pretty active social media feeds. So thank you for your time, and thank you, Victoria.
Thank you, Gwen. If everyone could join me in giving an incredibly huge round of applause for an amazing presentation. I know that it was it covered so much, but also went so deep and wasn't just a surface level overview, but really presented some, I think, big ideas that will continue the conversation on Slack and maybe our one-on-one round robins in the weeks to come. For now, there are lots of questions that I'm going to ask our fellows to come on and ask of you, Gwen. Patricia, would you like to come on and start off the Q&A?
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Gwen, for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. I am a doctoral candidate and I study in the United States what we call philanthropy. So exactly what you're talking about with community and the common good. I was very interested in understanding why it is important that the Health Research Centre be a nonprofit organization. You talked about your independence, and what is it that the status of a nonprofit brings to the Health Research Centre?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and gosh, I could talk for a while about this. But okay, I think the simplest answer is that this is our given the legislation in our region, our options are to be a nonprofit organization or a business, and so we're not a business at all. I mean, I guess some could frame it as such, but also I think it comes back to the values that I explained that, you know, this concept of piitselnuk, like we are doing this because we are of service to our communities. And this is what our community members have chosen for us as a profession. If you can sort of stretch to imagine what that might be like for me, for example, in my upbringing, I have been put in positions by my my teachers, my elders, or my community members to do this kind of work. So, you know, from a young age, it's like they're sort of cultivating you to sit in this position that you will later have to fulfill as a grown-up. And so for us, the center has to be nonprofit because we are doing this of service for the communities. It can't be for profit. It can't be for business. It has to be. I guess it's like the organizational setup that most closely aligns with the values. And of course, now there are social enterprise businesses, and we're trying to branch into that area as well, where you have a value-based business. But then you have to have individual shareholders and stockholders, and anyway, it just gets way more complicated than I'm interested in. And so, you know, as a neutral place for knowledge, you know, acquisition and elevation, the nonprofit society framework is the closest we can get to that as an organizational setup. Does that make sense? We're also working in, you know, on the topic of philanthropy. We've been working for years to actually get charitable status, so that we can receive charitable donations, but it's an extremely difficult process in Canada. It's 5 years so far that we've been working on that. So
yeah, I am on the board of the Arctic Youth Network, and I can confirm that charitable status in Canada is a long process.
Yes. Okay. You know.
Devora, would you like to come on and ask your question next?
Sure. Hayuname, Gwen, wonderful that you're here with us. It's Devora Newmark. And my question to you is about the climate change and health research project. I would love to know specifically more. You mentioned it in one of your bullets. Is it focused on mental health and climate change, or physical? Is there a arts-based methodology associated with that? Anything you could tell us about the specifics of that climate change research that you're working on?
Sure. So over the years, it's taken different forms. So initially, when climate change and health research sort of came onto the radar, maybe a little more than 10 years ago, you know, funding for that kind of research appeared before it really was identified as a community priority. And so we worked on a project with community members from around Nunavut to do a photo voice study on what they felt the links were between health and climate change in our communities, and, you know, what possible actions might be taken. That project was published in the journal Arctic. If you're interested, there's a publication in that journal. And then that led to a later study with youth using photo voice as well to get youth perspectives. And that was shared at the National Inuit Youth Conference a few years ago. And then that laddered up into more questions. Okay, what are we going to be tracking, and what should we be tracking as Nunavummiut in terms of indicators related to health-related indicators of climate change? And so that led to a workshop on a consensus process to identify those indicators with the various stakeholders here. That was also recently published in, I believe, the journal Arctic again. And then that's laddered up again into another project looking at, okay, how are we crowdsourcing, I guess, community-based observations of climate change and the different platforms that people are using? And for us, how are, you know, we're kind of trying to look at how we create a platform that can hold all of those different data sets in a way that's accessible to communities for affecting change. And so it kind of keeps laddering up into more and more and more questions. And that's kind of where we are now. Yeah.
That's great. And just I don't think I've spoken to you about this specifically, Gwen, but I'm currently involved in the West Baffin Eskimo Co-op project, Our Climate, Our People, Our Climate. And that's using drawings from Inuit children across Nunavut from the 1990s as a part of an Environment Canada project to have students do drawings about climate change back in 1994. And so the Our People, Our Climate project is now working with those drawings to locate the adults of those children, the adults of the children who drew those, to follow up about their experiences of climate change currently. So I'd love to talk with you more, or anybody on the call, about that project, and we're working with the youth interns to develop their interview skills, etc. So that might be a great dovetail, but I'd love to know more. I'm going to definitely follow up all of the different references you provided.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you and I can follow up because we're here. So.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and again, open invitation to connect with other fellows if anyone on the call heard something of interest and also wants to be a part of that conversation. For now, I'm going to ask Judith to come on and ask her question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation, Gwen. It was really interesting. I'm a student from Germany, and I'm currently working on a project looking at the effects of marine pollution on coastal Sami communities. And I was wondering if you maybe have already had a similar project or research project looking at the effects of marine pollution on health in your community.
Oh, there's a huge program of research on contaminants, especially because POPs, persistent organic pollutants, was a high priority topic for the Arctic Council in the early 2000s. And so that's probably one of the most widely studied published areas of study in the Arctic. So yeah, there's the Nunavut contaminants program, the northern contaminants program. Yeah, if you Google all these things, you'll find like piles of reports. And then also the Arctic Human Health and Development Report. What was it? AHDR. Anyway, there's quite a bit of literature out there around marine pollution, but also increasingly around marine noise pollution, and particularly around seismic testing for oil and gas deposits. It's you'll find a huge body of literature for sure.
And in our second hour, we will be hearing a lot more about that from Dr. Amina Schartup, and also about noise pollution in a few sessions from now when we talk about maritime movements. Isaac, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Gwen, for your presentation. I guess I really resonated with how you framed the heart-centered approach. And I was just wondering, does your research center face challenges when communicating this approach or using this language with the wider research community?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We get laughed at if that's the question. but it's more, but we don't care about that. It's when we talk about that in a room full of Nunavummiut and a room full of Northerners and Arctic people. And I've been in a program, I just concluded a program last year, an 18-month program, Fulbright program on the Arctic, and where they brought 18 of us scholars from around the Arctic together to sort of tackle different questions over 18 months. And when I talked about that to those people around the Arctic, they got it right away. They were like, yes, this is the language that we have been waiting for. that, you know, has not been really permitted or permissible in some of our academic spaces, because, you know, we're all supposed to be looking at things from a distance, through a microscope, through a lens, something that separates us as humans from our subject of study. But for us, you know, in the epistemology, you know, of our communities, or, you know, in my teaching here, I don't want to generalize it to everyone. So, you know, specific to our context, can't come to know something really without a relationship to it. And so the relationships between ourselves and our communities and the people we work with, and how we collaborate with others to implement a study, become the first thing we have to focus on, you know, and acknowledge and cherish and nurture. So it's the opposite, right? But in our you know, in our defense, and I had to defend this, you know, in my PhD defense, what it's that we are producing richer data, like 100%. We are getting more and better information than anyone ever has before, because that lens has not permitted people to express what they need to express around health and well-being, you know, in our context. I think that's one of our observations for sure.
Thank you. I'm trying to get as many questions in here before our second speaker as possible. So Aiden, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Gwen. I'd like to start by saying first, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I personally really enjoyed it, and I'll just really jump my question here. I'm really interested in food security in the Arctic, and how I've been reading a lot about how a lot of Inuit communities are starting to turn back to a lot of traditional food systems, harvesting whale, harvesting muskox at a larger rate in order to start using traditional foods again. And there have been a few studies written in the Canadian Arctic on how these improve problems with food security and nutritional deficits, and huge problems with how expensive groceries are in the Arctic in general. And I was curious if your center, the Qaujigiartiit Center, has done any work looking into the benefits of traditional food for food security, or if not, have you experienced anything regarding this as a member of the community? I would just be curious if you could unpack that a little more. Thanks.
Okay, that would probably take an hour, I guess, or more, but the short version is, I think the level of harvesting has remained the same in terms of the importance of country food like traditional in the diet of our community members, like everybody fishes and hunts. I think the harvesting pressure is you know, like these populations of caribou, for example, and seal, you know, were feeding a population of 4,000 people, you know, like 80 years ago. And now, you know, our population is 36,000 people. And, you know, there's questions about different pressures now on the animal populations that we all rely on for food. And, you know, we love our fish and seal and caribou and muskox and clams, all of it, right? And so so then, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a wide body of research on contaminants, and then with that, quite a lot of investigation into country food. So I think I was kind of speed reading questions. There's already been a ton of research, so we're not doing it, on the nutritional content. Like seal meat is probably the healthiest food on the planet, far healthier than an eggplant that's flown 3,000 kilometers to be here. Like seal meat is so nutritionally rich. And so there's actually on the Government of Nunavut Department of Health website, there's a nutrition resource fact sheet specifically on country foods and the nutritional content of every kind of country food and every way it can be prepared. So there's a ton of dietary research data on the benefits of our country foods. And then food security is a whole other kind of basket that I'm afraid I'm eating up the other presenters' time. But there's the Nunavut Food Security Coalition. They have a website. I recommend you check that out here. as well. And then we have a little bit of information on our website, you know, on the little bit that we've there, but, you know, there's a lot of other actors working on food security and country food.
Lots of resources to check out. And we are at time. I'm going to ask, I know we have a lot more questions, but I will ask Madison and then Jason to ask your 2 questions, because Jason's is a follow-up. And then the rest of the questions I've copied and pasted, and we can get to off of our live Zoom. So Madison and then Jason, do you want to ask the final questions before we move on to our second speaker?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So I just loved your organization's main values and how you obviously work incredibly hard to make sure all the voices of the members of your organization, but also the members of the community, make sure their priorities are heard. I'm part of a project management team on a very large multi-partner research project, and we work with researchers across multiple countries and cultures. And I just wondered, I know this is a very large question, but if you had any suggestions on ways which projects and organizations can really ensure that everyone's voice is heard, especially that of younger researchers. And also if you had any ways which your organization helps foster a supportive but also culturally sensitive environment, especially when working in a diverse group where you have people from all over the world conducting research.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. It's funny, when we, in our Fulbright Arctic program that I mentioned before, when we were all coming together, we said, okay, you know what, we're all going to share food together. This is going to be one of the things that brings us together. When we're in person, we share food together. It's kind of a great universal way to create a shared space for relationship building. Even though it sounds really simple, it's actually really important. And it's where a lot of that informal relationship building happens. In terms of working together across large multinational projects, gosh, I wish I had some advice for that. I don't know that I do. I think for us, we really try to make sure that we don't get swept away in what others are doing, you know, in terms of adhering to our values and our goals. And, you know, at the end of the day, the questions we ask ourselves is, what is this doing for our center and for communities? And that kind of helps us cut through spaces where we get bogged down. But that doesn't mean we don't get bogged down. We do, for sure. But yeah, just relationship building. And sometimes, like when we get a cold call, you know, I mean, we get cold calls all the time from researchers who are like, I'm curious about X, you know, can I work with you? And, you know, we almost never will work with people we haven't built a relationship with. So, you know, in order for that project to move forward, we would have to meet with them. We would have to talk with them. We'd have to learn about what's going on and who's there and who's in the room and who's involved, who's funding it. And then, you know, kind of work on building a relationship before we even decide if we can work together. So it's, and I know researchers get frustrated because I've seen it, that they get frustrated with us because they're like, well, I'm trying to do this and can't you see that this is good for you? And, you know, and I have to say, well, that's, you know, that's our decision. And, you know, we have to make sure it's good for us and a good fit for our communities and for the kind of work that we're doing. And that takes time. And so we, you know, it is hard to be confronted, I think, at times with that perspective or that entitlement. I find sometimes there's like a narrative around entitlement to the Arctic and, you know, driven by different discourses. And, you know, our perspective doesn't, I think, align with that. And so that causes some, you know, some butting of heads, I suppose.
Yeah, and we'll circle back to specifically this theme in our final session with Dr. Keola Fox, who will talk about ethical and unethical research partnerships. Jason, did this answer your question, or do you want to still ask your follow-up from Madison?
I'll add pretty quickly. First of all, thank you, Madison, for that question, but also thank you, Gwen, for this amazing presentation. Qaujigiartiit. So I'm not from, but I live in Nunavut now. I'm actually a master's student who became a Northerner because I became very exhausted and just tired of the ways that like research was being done. And part of this was because through my research, I noticed a lot of interpersonal conflict between researchers, especially down south, and community members in the north that I didn't know how to navigate through my research because I work in a community-based participatory framework. I use photo voice as well. I do participatory video and photo, media production. But one thing that I couldn't find like solid guidance or like readings about was like how to navigate these interpersonal conflicts. So for example, when community members are like, I don't want to, like, they feel uncomfortable, they feel exploited by the ways that like Southerners come up and just use organizations here as a, for example, a checkbox to get their funding. So how do you navigate those sorts of conversations when they come up and when they're very like obvious, heavy emotional like toll that is brought up? And like, I just don't find that academia teaches us how to navigate these situations. So I was wondering if you have any pointers as to how to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I know the climate that you're describing is not uncommon, and here too. I think one of the things that I've observed is our center here has helped change the landscape of some of those challenges that you're describing in the NWT. Because we also, so in Nunavut, there's a Scientists Act. There's also one in the NWT. We have the same act. And as part of that act, scientists who come to the north have to be licensed to do research. And so in Nunavut, for the health side of things, we've worked very closely with our Nunavut Research Institute, which is the licensing body, to make sure the reviews of health research projects, health and well-being research projects, and some like social cultural related projects go through a really rigorous review process. And so we work closely with our colleagues at Nunavut, like claimization, and in the government of Nunavut to make sure these basically to protect our communities from that frustration, like from unethical behaviors, from that from poorly designed studies. I mean, for sure, because I mean, we do have this climate, we do have a fear of research in some of our communities because of terrible things that have been done in the past. Like in one community, somebody showed up and, started pulling people's teeth out. And then there was the skin graft study in Igloolik, in the 70s. Like, this is in the living memory of our elders and some of our adult population. So it's not like this is very long ago. This is still recent. So of course, we are extremely mindful of what is and isn't ethical, in terms of our own work, but then also we're engaging in these other spaces like related to licensing, which is not our work, but where we are working with our colleagues to, I guess, provide rigorous reviews to studies that are proposed to take place here. And for sure, we get frustrated and at times angry researchers who are not happy with our processes. But our argument is you have to rethink what it means to be ethical and to be aligned with the priorities of our communities, first and foremost. So I don't know if I answered your question. Maybe I made it worse by giving too much information.
No, that's great. Qaujigiartiit.
Yeah, I think you gave a great segue to continuing this conversation, which I think a lot of people, I saw a lot of head nods to continue it in our continued conversations channel on Slack to share, your thoughts, follow-up questions. and to not let this conversation stop now. But I am conscious that we have taken over an hour of your day. So if everyone could again join me in giving a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much, Gwen, for putting together and sharing that presentation, answering so many of our questions with such insights, being so honest through them, and just, thank you. And I really hope that me, but also everyone else gets to meet you in the not so distant future, and that we can share some good food somewhere in 2022, maybe through an Arctic event or the Research Coordination Network that Gwen is also a collaborator on, that is supporting this Arctic Winter College. So thank you, Gwen. I hope you have a wonderful day and that you found this a meaningful conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the great questions. I just kind of quickly was scanning them, and I hope, yeah, it sounds like you're all going to have a great discussion. And thank you for listening. If I was able to contribute anything to your great discussion, I'm grateful for that. So thank you. And good luck with the rest of your presentations.
Thank you. And we are going to continue with another incredible presenter in our second hour of our health and well-being session today. I'm not going to take up more time and just going to quickly introduce our second speaker, Dr. Amina Schartup, who I invite to take the virtual stage and share a bit about herself before going into her presentation. Dr. Schartup is an assistant professor at the University of California, San Diego, and she's going to share, I think, some pretty incredible research from the lab that she runs, but also her own experiences, which I think will be a great follow-up to Gwen's presentation. So Dr. Schartup, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself so I can find you on our call and spotlight you for all of our fellows.
Hi, I'm right here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very excited to be here. It's nice to scroll through the list of names and seeing some familiar names. So I am an assistant professor at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at University of California, San Diego, as Victoria mentioned. Before that, I was a AAAS Science and Technology and Policy Fellow at the Office of Polar Program at the National Science Foundation in the United States, where I was working in the Arctic section. And some of the project that I worked on was to revisit the principles for conducting research in the Arctic, which is a federal guide and document for scientists looking at how to conduct ethical research, as well as working on Arctic call for development forum projects in various other Arctic resilience related projects. Before that, I was a research associate at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, where I worked on some of the projects that I will be talking about today. I'm also involved in the Northern Contaminants Program on the technical review side of it. So I've heard that was mentioned earlier. So this is a Canadian program to fund pollution contaminants research in the Arctic. And as you guessed, I will be talking about a pollutant, mercury, that is particularly of interest for a community who live in the north. And I guess I can share my screen, hopefully. Let's see how this works. Oops, that's not going to work. Sorry, I was trying to do the share like portion of the screen, but I guess I'll just share the whole screen. Can you see this now?
Yes.
Excellent. So as you guessed, I will be talking about mercury in the Arctic, and I will really focus on the project that I worked on as a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health, which was right after I completed my PhD at the University of Connecticut. And also really try to get to what are the drivers and what are the biogeochemical processes that we're interested in the Arctic and how these impact Arctic communities, as well as briefly discuss what are the possible future trends in mercury levels in biota. So before I get into this, we'll talk about why do we care about mercury in the first place, and discuss about the speciation of mercury, which is what are the different forms of mercury that are present in the environment, and why do we care about methylmercury, which is the form that I will be discussing mostly today. And also we will finish this up by looking at the distribution of methylmercury globally in the global oceans, but particularly why are the concentration particularly elevated in Arctic marine biota. So a little bit about mercury. Mercury is a metal, as you may have known, and a lot of you may have seen that it exists in this liquid, pretty shiny form, but it also comes in different species, which is and different isotopes. And different isotopes is just a natural kind of breakdown of mercury that exists in the environment, and the concentration of these naturally different types of mercury that are present in the environment can be useful to look at, for example, the origin of the mercury in the fish. So we kind of use it as a fingerprinting or of a source of mercury. We also use those different isotopes to kind of trace how mercury changes in the environment. So we would add certain one of these isotopes into water or sediment, and then look at how it then propagates across different reservoirs that we're interested in. And I'll get to it later. Another thing that is important to realize is that mercury in the environment exists in different, what we call species, so forms. There is the organic species, such as dimethylmercury or monomethylmercury, and they have different properties. For example, the elemental mercury right there is very volatile, so it gets removed from the water column really quickly. Divalent mercury, on the other hand, just is particle reactive, so it binds to things and just settles. Monomethylmercury is really the one we are interested in when we're talking about fish. So if you've heard that mercury is dangerous for people and then it's in fish, what people are actually talking about is this monomethylmercury species. They're not talking about just mercury in general. And this is important to understand what is going on later in this talk. So the forms of mercury determine its health impact. Inorganic mercury broadly is not that dangerous because it's quickly removed from the organism. It has what we call a low absorption rate. So when you ingest it, you can eliminate it quite rapidly in most of it. So it doesn't stay in the organism. Methylmercury, on the other hand, is quite the opposite. It what we call accumulates in the organism, and it actually also biomagnifies, which means that as you move up the food chain in the marine systems, the higher the predator is in the food chain, so the more animals are below it, the more methylmercury it will have. So think about something like a shark that is really high, like apex predator, or marine mammals that are carnivorous, that consume fish, that consumes fish, that consumes fish, etc. ends up having really high concentrations of methylmercury. And of course, as humans who literally sit on top of that entire world food pyramid, we are the ultimate apex predator if we consume other apex predators. So our exposure can be quite high depending on which type of marine mammals we consume. Methylmercury impacts the nervous system, the central nervous system, and it's particularly dangerous for developing brains, so young children, and so that's why they tell pregnant women to not consume large quantities of sharks and high predator fish. And there's quite a long history of usages for mercury. It has really interesting both physical and chemical properties, which used to be about 3,000 years ago, between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, used for as a painting. It has this really bright red color as a cinnabar, which is the mineral form of it. And so it was used to paint pottery. It was found in Egyptian pyramids and Chinese pottery from back then. It was also used to treat all kinds of diseases because people thought that it actually could treat diseases. There's the chemical properties are interesting, and one usage that has, at least in the United States and many other countries, resulted in high contamination of a lot of ecosystems, especially estuarine systems, where the usage of mercury in the felting industry. And this started out because sometimes in the 17th or 18th century, the French who were felting hats realized that when some Turkish felters, when they were using camel hair, and they realized that if the camel hair had urine on it, that they would end up producing much nicer felt. So when the French realized that camel urine made for nicer felt, they thought, well, it's hard to get camel urine, so how about we try human urine? And this worked, but there was a person in the group that was getting much, much better felt with his urine, and they kind of put two and two together and realized he was treating his syphilis with mercury, because like I said, they were using mercury as a medicine. And so they thought, oh, maybe the mercury in his urine is the one that actually makes this nicer felt. So they started introducing mercury usage into felting. And so that's how we ended up with large felting, mercury contamination from the felting industry. And as I said, because we have this long history of usage of mercury, the natural cycle of mercury has been perturbed. So humans have added a significant portion more of mercury into the environment. So the natural cycle of mercury is mercury leaves the volcanic activity or hydrothermal vents. It has a long residence time in the atmosphere, which means that it spends about 6 months just going around the globe, which means that he can deposit pretty much anywhere, including the Arctic. And once it's in the atmosphere, like I said, it can deposit either on soil or ocean. When it's in the ocean, so this is how humans have increased the amount that we add from our our mining and just power coal burning activities, which is actually the #1 source of mercury to the environment. Mercury deposits in oceans or aquatic bodies where it can be converted microbially to methylated mercury forms, which are the ones that we are concerned about. And then the methylmercury then biomagnifies in the food web. So you can reach really high concentrations in those, like I mentioned, predatory fish. It so happens that because mercury accumulates in those high predatory fish, that northern indigenous communities are at greater risk of exposure. And this is due to two primary reasons. One reason is, as I said, it's consumption of apex predators, so fish and marine mammals that are high in the food chain, but also because for some reason in the Arctic Ocean, the marine biota there has higher concentrations of methylmercury. And so I'll get to it as to why that's the case. So this is an example from this, that's from the AMAP 2011 report, looking at exposure of mercury levels in humans, and this was, I think it was maternal blood levels. And so the distribution you can see here in red is the WHO limit, and then this one I think is the US limit for exposure that is lower. But as you can see, some communities have really high exposure to methylmercury there. For the general population, so this is the US methylmercury intake by consumption of different seafood. And as you can see, tuna is #1 by far, and closely followed by shrimp. Shrimp is actually not particularly high per se in methylmercury. It's just that people consume really large quantities of it. And as you can see, this is the origin. So each color here is the origin of where the fish is coming from. It's quite of a broad problem. People consume fish from all over the world, and so the exposure is kind of a patchiness of all kinds of sources of mercury. So let's get to this project that I worked on that I mentioned earlier. So this is that's the Churchill River, and there was a hydroelectric development planned at the time. Now it's pretty much done around Lake Melville, which is actually an estuarine fjord that is surrounded by several communities in Rigolet, Northwest River, and then Happy Valley Goose Bay. And about half of the system is part of the Nunavut government province. And so the question that the communities had for us when they approached us was, would a hydroelectric development that is planned in the community impact the mercury level in their fish, in their hunting and fishing grounds? And the question came because there's a long history of hydroelectric reservoir creation resulting in high methylmercury levels in fish. And so the communities were aware of this, and so they asked us to review the human health impact as well as the environmental health impact of this planned reservoir. So really briefly, how did we end up, do we care about hydro? And well, this is how the system looked like before they started constructing. So this is a picture I took in 2012 when we went, and then they built the reservoir, so it looks quite different. So why do we end up with methylmercury concern when we're building a reservoir? So like I said, we emit mercury globally, and it just floats around in the atmosphere before it deposits in soils or oceans. So when it deposits in soils, it just mostly just sits there as inorganic mercury. And I said, inorganic mercury is not that toxic. However, when you create a reservoir, what you do is you take a bunch of soil and you flood it, right? So you add water to it. And so the microbes that are now in that soil have all these organic matter and all this mercury that has been accumulating there for decades, if not thousands of years. And so this inorganic mercury gets transformed to that methylmercury, which is the toxic form of mercury. And then that form then biomagnifies in the food webs, which results in a very high level in some cases. And so there's a long history and knowledge behind this reservoir creation and hydro intersection with high level of mercury. So this is the system that we were looking at. So as I mentioned, this is Lake Melville, which is an estuary. So here to the right, you have the Labrador Sea. So these are the communities that we were working with. And the reservoir was somewhere here. Let's see if you can see this, but the reservoir is over here in Muskrat Falls. And as I said, the communities are kind of spread around the Lake Melville. And so what we did was, what we wanted to do, I'll give you the big picture here before I keep going into more details. So the big picture is this: we have the system where we actually didn't have any data as to how mercury cycled in the system. And we're trying to figure out how a reservoir over here will then result in a pulse of methylmercury that would potentially impact the levels in the fish and the marine mammals that consume food around this area. And so the other side of it was, okay, what are the baseline exposure of the communities around Lake Melville? How much of their diet is connected to this fishing and hunting in the system? And how will this potentially change as we increase the methylmercury levels potentially through a pulse from that system? So what we wanted to do is get the baseline information from the system, so create a biogeochemical model that connects the reservoir to Lake Melville, and then has the ability to then look at future projection if we send a pulse through the reservoir and how that propagates across the food web. And then we also wanted to know what the baseline diet for people were, so we can then scale, if we know how much they eat right now, what their current exposure is, and we can predict how much the concentration will increase in the fish, we can make some sort of a guesstimate or estimate, hopefully good one, as to what the potential increase for people is. So that was kind of the big picture plan. So we did that. We went out there and we collected a bunch of samples. We worked with Joey Akearok as well the community, and this is his fishing boat. We collected pretty much everything we could: sediment concentration, water concentrations, both in the rivers, all the tributaries that bring the water out there in the Labrador Sea, and we built a baseline model of how mercury cycles in the system. And one of the big findings that we had that actually made a difference in terms of what we think the future projections were, was that the system was extremely stratified. So almost everything was connected to what is happening in the first 10, 20 meters of the system, which is problematic because anybody who has done the salinity exercise where you pour fresh water on top of salty water, it kind of floats. This is what's happening. So you have this reservoir that is placed on the river where you're going to increase the methylmercury concentration, and then you're going to flood it down, a downstream system. So all this methylmercury that was in the river would just stay at the surface. And this is problematic because a lot of the biological activity is also occurring at the surface near where the sunlight is, which means that the impact of a potential increase in methylmercury are magnified in the system. So how do we try to figure out how much methylmercury may, by how much methylmercury may increase in the reservoir once it's created? So we did incubation experiments where we took soil cores from the reservoir area. So we went there and just collected soil cores that we then poured the river water that is going to be used to flood the system into that. And then we ran an experiment over time looking by how much methylmercury is going to increase. And we compared different types of soils and cores. And then overall, the trends was pretty clear that anytime you flood soils that have never been flooded before, they start producing methylmercury. We also relied on literature information to look at how a reservoir, like soils, like reservoirs that have been created in the past, by how much the methylmercury has increased in them. And then use those relationships to project how much we think the future reservoir is going to release, how much methylmercury is going to release into the downstream environment. And then we then connected all the pieces together and we looked at, okay, so if we increase the methylmercury by this much, how much are we going to see of that increase in the river and all the way down to the downstream estuary? And so our predictions were about 10 times increase in the river and about 2.5 times increase in the estuarine surface. And this range is consistent with what we observed in other systems that have been flooded. So one thing that was interesting with this project is this was the first time that the work was done before a reservoir was created. A lot of the reservoir related methylmercury work has been done post creation. So it's kind of interesting to see what we think is going to happen and then get to compare to what is actually happening. For the fish, what we did is that we asked the community to provide us with just whatever they eat, where they get the food from, fishermen collected, local foods, country foods, and we then measure them for mercury, both what people eat from the stores, the store-bought, as well as locally caught. And we measure the mercury concentration in various food stuff. Another issue we ran into is in trying to project what the baseline concentration and by how much it would increase, is that we need to know the species that people do eat that are collected locally, how much time do they spend in the river versus the estuary versus neither, right? If they're store-bought or they're spent time in the marine environment. Because remember, we're projecting that the increases are highest in the river, in the reservoir, and then a little bit lower in the estuary, and then none in the marine system, right, in the Labrador Sea. So the question was trying to figure out how much time do different animals spend in different water bodies. And so we used isotopes of mercury as well as other isotope tracer to figure out, okay, how much time do species spend in freshwater versus the estuary versus neither. And then we scaled this to get what our projected contributions are going to be. So in gray here, you have in left here, you have the species that people consume, and in gray is the baseline concentration of mercury in that fish. And then we calculated what would be the projected levels based on how much time those different species spend in the river versus the estuary versus neither. And so we are saying that the contribution of methylmercury currently to the people diet is about 70% at baseline, and then we think that the increase is going to be up to 89% if people continue to eat the same type of diet, if the diet doesn't change. So how do we calculate this? Well, one way to do it, and at least that's the way we did it here, was to figure out, well, how much what people eat, how much of it do they eat? And to do that, you pass out dietary surveys. This was really quite amazing because, and this is discussed in Ryan's paper, is that we really had a really high community participation. Usually it's really difficult to get a large fraction of community, but because this was driven by a question that the community had rather than by something that we necessarily approached the community, the participation was about 90%. So most people filled out the dietary surveys. Most people provided some information about what they consume and how much of it. And so once we have that information, as well as how much mercury is in what they consume, it's easy to calculate what is the typical exposure in the population. And so from there, we can calculate, okay, what is the baseline exposure and what is the exposure going to be, knowing the concentration or the projected concentration, as well as assuming that people will not change their diet as a result of the reservoir. Oh, and I forgot to mention that, as you can see, that our projections were that that most people, a lot of the people were already really near at least the US limits for what is an acceptable level of methylmercury, but a significant portion of the population post-flooding is expected, at least based on our calculations, to exceed the US EPA limit. Well, it's not really a limit, it's just a recommended dose, and also the Canadian limits, which is problematic because, and one of the things that we really wanted to bring home and make clear when we're talking about things like that is, yes, so the methylmercury, if you calculate the levels of exposure from the food, most of the methylmercury exposure is coming from the intake of locally caught food and traditional foods. However, these foods are also really nutritious And they contain, they provide a lot of DHA, a lot of vitamin D, and so on. And so one of the things, and in a way that the benefits of country food and traditional foods outweigh the levels of contaminants that you have in it. And so the point is not to tell people don't eat the traditional foods. This is not something we want. The key is that what we want to pressure and push people for is like take action to reduce the methylmercury levels in the food. And we don't want to, so that's one reason, because of the nutritious aspect of the traditional food, but also the importance and the social well-being that comes from being able to collect and eat the traditional foods. And also because there's like the option sometimes is just not there. Somebody mentioned earlier that ridiculously expensive. This is a picture we took when I think it was in Northwest River, of just the cost of some meat. So what we want is to make sure that design, development, and hydroelectric reservoirs in order to mitigate this. And there are ways to do this. The less land you flood, the less methylmercury you're going to produce if you do run under of the river hydro development. So there are technological things we can do to avoid this situation. So Ryan then took, he was curious and see where the hydro development planned in Canada, and what are the potential exposures that we can see. And then what he found was that if you look at the planned, at least at the time, if you look at the planned developments around Canada, almost all of them are located within 100 kilometers of an Indigenous community. And then they have variant impacts on the methylmercury level in the foods. And so the idea here was to think about, okay, how can we develop reservoirs in order to limit the impact that they will have? So this was an example of how we developed and applied a framework that links the geochemistry and biogeochemistry of mercury to human exposures directly, and how this can be used to then reduce the impact on the communities. So the questions, I guess, broadly is not just about the Arctic, but just generally, like on a philosophical level, as we as a human society is trying to reduce the impact of our actions on communities. Because of the scale of the energy production, how much energy we need, really regardless of the type of energy that we choose, it will have an environmental and human cost. Now the question, and that we need to be really honest about it and try to make sure that we don't put the burden on certain communities disproportionately, is to ask ourselves, like, when we turn on a light switch, what community is being impacted? And how can we make sure that they're not, and that the pain is actually shared evenly across everybody who benefits from whatever we're doing. But unfortunately, and it's not just in the Arctic, it's broadly all over the world, that the impact of environmental changes, as well as some of the solution that we're proposing, disproportionately impacts Indigenous communities. And so this is something that we really need to be cognizant of. So as I mentioned earlier, what is one of the questions that came out of this was there are really interesting similarities between mercury cycling in the Arctic as well as mercury cycling in this particular system. It actually functions very similarly to the Arctic Ocean, which is often called an estuary. And so in a way, working on this project that was really driven by community interest and questions helped us as scientists also understand what may be happening broadly in the Arctic. And so this is an example of how a project that is really driven by questions from communities also has an impact on the scientific, more like blue sky questions that we have. So what we found was that for the first time working on the system, we found that there is methylation of mercury in the Arctic seawater. And so in estuarine seawater, and the mercury methylation is what the process that converts this inorganic mercury into that organic mercury. And another thing that we found is that this is driven by the stratification, which means, like I said, this like very fresh water or relatively fresh water sitting on that salty water. And that's really what we are seeing also happening in the Arctic Ocean broadly. So I'll quickly go from that to talking about, mercury biogeochemistry in the Arctic Ocean and how come we end up with these relatively high concentration in the biota. And is there really, understanding why it's the case may help us as a global community think about ways that we can mitigate that or remediate at this point. As I said, one interesting aspect of mercury is that it kind of hops around the environment, where it goes from, emissions from coal power plants and kind of goes in the soil, gets re-emitted and so on. And because of that, it has a high residence time and then ends up accumulating in even remote and pristine areas, leading to high concentrations in some fish. So what we did in the Arctic was that in the Arctic Ocean is that we looked at mercury distribution in the water column. And so this is the two organic forms of mercury. So you have monomethylmercury, which is the one that biomagnifies the food web, and that's another one, I won't mention it. But we also did incubation experiments using isotopes, where, as I mentioned earlier, we take a water sample, we inject mercury isotopes, and we look at how it transforms. And we did indeed find, just like in Lake Melville, that methylmercury production is really happening near the surface in the top 200 meters. And that is why we think there is high levels in biota, because unlike other oceans where you see a peak lower in the water column, this one is actually really close to where a lot of the biological activity is happening, resulting in the quick accumulation of that mercury by the food web. Unlike other systems where, the peak is down here, so you uptake it up, it takes a while for it to get to the food web, at least the phytoplankton. We also took this into a global model to look at it. And can we see why the levels are high in biota? So what we did is that we worked with, Yangshu Zhang, and using some of the algorithms I developed for another project, we plugged them in, looked at how does methylmercury is produced into the water column, as well as that gets taken up at a global scale, and see if we can identify the reasons we see those higher concentration in the Arctic. So this is a map of methylmercury level modeled global seawater methylmercury concentrations. As you can see here, it's pretty clear those polar regions. The surface levels, so this is the surface 0 to 100 meters. You can clearly see that the surface has the highest methylmercury levels. And there is a range of reasons for that. One reason is that the water is very cold, which means that the demethylation, so the breaking down of methylmercury, does not happen as quickly. You also have it's dark, so you have less photodemethylation, which means that the methylmercury that is formed is not broken down as easily. So you end up with this, and then of course you have the stratification of the water column, so you end up with the methylmercury really high in the surface. And so this is the case in both polar regions. So these high surface concentrations, then of course, if you have them near where the phytoplankton activity is happening. So this is the methylmercury in all type of phytoplankton. Here you can see that the poles are also particularly elevated in concentrations of methylmercury. Then of course it changes depending on the phytoplankton, specific phytoplankton you look at. Of course, when you take it to the next level and look at who eats the phytoplankton, you'll see a little bit of differences between the types of phytoplankton. But again, these regions, there are northern regions with colder waters, end up accumulating more methylmercury. And so we think that this is one of the driving reasons for the higher concentration in biota in the Arctic. And on this, I want to just thank my co-authors as well as the funding sources. And really the take-home message here was what I said earlier in my previous take-home message, as well as the next step really is to try to figure out how the ongoing changes that we're seeing in the Arctic, from sea ice decline through rapid warming, coastal erosion, permafrost thawing, is potentially impacting those levels. Because as I said, these are rapidly changing ecosystems, but people who live there are still relying on high quality and nutritious food. And so what we don't want to see is that because of increasing contaminants level, that we actually pass this threshold where the food is actually now still nutritious, even with the levels of methylmercury that we're seeing in there, that we will pass beyond that thresholds. And so what kind of action do we need to take at the global levels to make sure that we don't actually get there, which of course includes reduction in emissions, reduction in usage of coal power plants. But as we switch away from coal power plants, we also need to think about how those alternative energy sources may impact the community directly, locally, even if at a broader scale, we are reducing carbon emissions. And again, I would like to thank everyone, and I am ready for your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If everyone could again join me in giving a virtual round of applause for an incredibly stimulating presentation. And I definitely think that last question of, the transition of our energy systems and how we should think about this in that context is something that we can definitely continue the discussion on, and we can bring back in our energy session a few weeks from now. We have a few questions for you already lined up. I'm going to first ask Nicholas if you would like to come on and ask your question.
Yes, I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting no visuals right now. So thank you, Dr. Schartup. That was, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. That was really interesting. I'm a social scientist, so this is all very kind of outside my wheelhouse, but obviously not only peripheral, but deeply integrated into these social concerns, justice concerns. I had two questions. The first one, which is very short, was you showed that map of mercury exposure levels in the Arctic. I was wondering how that compares to other regions of the world, especially ones that are where food production and food consumption comes from, is more industrial versus places that are still living kind of subsistence or living small artisanal fisheries and things like that, if there's data on mercury there. But my main question is, what was your experience being part of this research project with Muskrat Falls in terms of who you were able to communicate with? Were you all called into the public inquiry that happened after the kind of dismissal of the environmental concerns? What was your experience just like being a scientist at the table with politicians and I don't remember if it was Quebec Hydro or which company was helping develop that. But Narcor, right. So yeah, so if you could just tell
questions. Yes. Wow, I forgot the first question as I started thinking about your second and third. What was your first question?
Just how do methylmercury exposure levels compare between the Arctic and other parts of the world?
Right. So yes. So for the comparison is that it's really depends on each community and what they consume, right? So if you have a community that's highly dependent on fish consumption and marine mammals, so if you have like Faroe Island communities that are really relying on seafood, then you have high levels of exposure. Now, once you move out of the Arctic, the concentration or exposure levels tend to decline because people rely more on industrial agricultural foods, and their consumption of marine predators is just slower. So you see typically high levels of exposure in Arctic communities over the rest of the world. Yes, experience on the ground. This was a really a group work where different parts of the group were working on different parts of the project. So in a way, we all had a different experience. When I started out in 2012, it was our first trip was myself and our lab manager. At the time, it was the University of Connecticut, but then he moved to Harvard, and we were pretty much just solo, the two of us, working on the ground, collecting as many samples as we could to build the system. I thought that it was really nice to be driven around by Joey. We fish here, we don't fish here. You should check out this spot. So that was really nice. Of course, like we ran into the similar issues that I think somebody else mentioned after the previous talk, where it was like really in some ways, sometimes not as easy to make sure that the way that we have to conduct the science in order to be publishable, and in order to collect the type of information that we need, and just the whole process necessarily aligns with what the community at the times needs and the timelines and so on. And so that reconciling these two worlds, whoever is doing this work, and I think our presenter from before is doing some of that, is crucial, because we are working in different worlds in terms of timing and in what the delivery of the work needs to look like. So there's definitely room to improve there for our side as scientists and the academia in general. And the third question was
more related to the actual, the dam construction, the fact that it all was pushed through regardless of these clear, very definitive findings.
Yeah, it's hard. It's just, the money's there, the interests are there. And from the get-go, the point, as far as we were concerned, at least the science team was concerned, the idea was to deliver well-documented, well-constrained numbers in terms of what is the current exposure and what are the potential impacts for the political side of it, to figure out a way to make sure that this is done fairly, right? It wasn't necessarily, we want you to stop. That's not our decision to make. That is the community's decision to make if they want the project, because at the same time, communities who live around the area have also mixed interests, right? Some people depend on the jobs that come with it. Other people depend on the fishing. So this is something that needs to be worked out within the community. Our concern was make sure that we provide all the sides with something they can rely on. So yes, I'm not surprised that this continued, but there have been some victories where what we were asking for is for them to monitor the levels as they plan on flooding, which they've done. And so we actually working on a paper that is a follow-up to this one, with now that it has been flooded, and we have been collecting data. Well, not us, they hired a consulting lab that was independent to collect levels of mercury as the system progressed. So that was a good victory, I think, for the community, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to be conscious of your time. We are at the hour. Do you have a few more minutes for a few other questions, or do you have to go?
Sure.
Okay. Then Sasha, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I was wondering, In addition to the increased mercury concentrations from the flooding of that area, I know that Goose Bay is home to some infrastructure such as a large military airstrip. And I wonder if those kind of large infrastructure and human-built environment have a large impact on the mercury concentration, or is that completely overshadowed by the flooding?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I've asked myself the same thing, because when we would drive around and walk around some of the parts, you could see they kind of like closed it off, and you can see that they haven't really cleaned up. If you look over, you know, in the grass and so on, you can see just stuff that was left from, I don't know, World War II or whenever that was. So in theory, if there is any construction, because of the usage of mercury in almost a lot of things, there's a potential for increased just contamination. But that, I mean, we tried to sample around some of these areas to see if we see a signal, and we didn't necessarily see a particularly a higher signal than elsewhere, but that could just be that, you know, the mercury, at least that is trapped there, is just trapped in either the soil or has already come into the system and is sedimented. Some of it is really driven by just the, like I said, the species of mercury we're interested in. And so in this particular case, almost, I don't expect that this, or I don't think that this historical usage has as much of an impact as the hydro that is planned. The mercury that has been depositing from atmospheric into soils is just very reactive. The microbes, they're taking up that organic matter, they're sending that pulse, and the freshness and where it is in the water column matters. So no, I don't think it has as much of an impact, or yes, it's smaller than the hydro plant.
Thank you. Yulia, would you like to come on and ask your question?
If you meant me, you said Julia, I think, but I'm not quite sure.
Yulia? But maybe Yulia is having some issues coming on. So Susanna, do you want to go next? And I'll try to get in touch with Yulia.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the presentation. Like Nicholas, I'm coming from this as a social science background, so apologies for the naivety perhaps of this question. But I'm just wondering, the mercury, I understand when we're talking about in the fish, and I understand that process. I'm just wondering what the other implications are health-wise with mercury contamination and creating reservoirs, flooding the water. And are there risks to drinking water, to crops that might be growing in that area? Other ways in which people are ingesting this new mercury that isn't just through the fish? Thank you.
And before you answer,
thank you for your question.
Oh, sorry,
okay.
I'm going to tag on Yulia's question because I'm going to read it for her, because she is also interested in if climate change is going to increase exposure rates. And she also asks, what else can be done to tackle the issue besides reducing fish intake?
Yes, so first question, no. So the levels in the water are extremely low by exposure, if you're looking at exposure. The reason that methylmercury is problematic is because it biomagnifies, so it increases from the water up to the higher trophic level fish 1 million times, 10 million times. And so once it reaches the really high levels in high predatory fish, that's when we're starting to bring about exposure. But it's, as far as no, of course, we can never say never. I mean, the levels, decrease all the time in terms of what is a healthy or okay level to be exposed to. As of now, the science is saying that there's not going to be any health impacts from drinking water. And then Julia's question.
Julia's question was
at the global. Climate change impacts and exposure. Is that it?
Yes.
Don't ask me two questions at the same time.
Sorry. Yeah, so Julia's question was what you just said and what can be done to tackle the issue besides reducing fish intake.
Yes, so what our goal is, and it's been the case, so here's the public health perspective on this. When we tell people don't consume fish because it has high methylmercury level, very often people switch to something that is even less healthy for them. So from a public health perspective, reducing fish consumption out of fear of exposure to methylmercury is not something that anybody wants from a public health perspective. Now, people who are concerned about, conservation and environmental, species and overfishing, that's a different problem. But from public health perspective, this is not what we want. What we want is to just reduce the level of mercury in the fish so people can continue to consume healthy foods without being exposed to methylmercury. And so in order to do that, we need to reduce emissions. And so that is the focus of global programs and conventions, like the Minamata conventions, is just reduce emissions of mercury.
Great, thank you. And I think our final question for the session, Felicia, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you were aware if there have been any studies done to see if there's similar mercury increases for like small in-river hydro or like the new wave energy generators.
So is small hydro?
Like here at the University of West Fairbanks, we're working on creating these like small in-river hydro. So there's no damming or anything. They're like devices in river. There's been a lot of studies on fishes, but I hadn't seen anything on mercury.
Yeah, so in order for, so the levels of methylmercury production in reservoirs is related to how much soil you flood. It's almost proportional, right? So the more soil you flood, the more methylmercury you will produce. So if whatever system is designed to flood as little or no soil at all, because if you saw that, you remember that I had this plot that shows the areas where we took cores that were never flooded before versus the cores that were flooded occasionally. You don't see any production in methylmercury from the occasional flood soils. You can only see from the ones that never been flooded. So if your hydro doesn't flood, doesn't create a reservoir, you will not see an increase in methylmercury.
Thank you. And I think at 10 past, we have taken up much of your day. And I think we have gotten to all of our questions. So if everyone could again join me in a huge virtual round of applause for Dr. Schartup. Thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. And you, in those final takeaways, have given us starter conversations to continue after this. So thank you for doing that work for me so that we can continue the conversation. But thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us for this session. Next week, we will be moving on to our terrestrial changes. So we'll be talking about fires and ecosystems in the Arctic and subarctic, and we'll also be talking about Arctic greening. I'll follow up with an email with the recording and contact for this session, and I look forward to seeing all of you next Tuesday, and hopefully some of you on Monday for our social event. Until then, I hope everyone has a wonderful, healthy, and stress-free week, and I will see you next week. Bye, everyone.